Hello, welcome to our discussion on nonverbal delivery. In this video, we're going to talk about a variety of elements of nonverbal delivery that are important to keep in mind when it comes to public speaking. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about posture. A couple of things to keep in mind with posture. And by the way, all of the elements that we're going to talk about today, uh, this has been heavily researched with audience perceptions when they see a presentation or a speech, or when they just see somebody speaking. So some of this applies to public speaking, and some of this actually also applies to just psychologically how we read nonverbals, even in non-speech settings. So this could be one-on-one. This could be in a small group setting where you're sitting around at a conference table. So it applies to a variety of contexts, and this is basically research on how audiences will interpret things. So, as terms of your posture and sort of general placement of your hands, you want to stand upright and take a step forward when others are talking. This conveys interest, and take a step back when responding. Place your arms to your side or on your hip, but not in your pockets or behind your back. So, staying upright, obviously, standing upright, not slouching. Basically, audiences will read that as you're invested, you care, right? That you think something's important because your body language is suggesting that you're paying attention, right? It's sort of like when you're talking to somebody and they're not making eye contact with you, right? You are more likely to think that they're just not interested in what you're saying because they're not making eye contact. So the same thing happens with your posture. If the person is kind of turned away from you, if you as the speaker are turned away from your audience, if you're not facing them, if you're not sort of upright with your posture, right, forward with it, then people just think you're not really invested, you don't really care, right? And again, you can apply this, like I mentioned, these apply in non-public speaking settings. So think of it in a small group setting. You're in the workplace and you're in a conference room and people are talking and you're just kind of slouched back like this, rocking in your chair versus staying upright and listening, right? Giving that signal non-verbally that you're listening because you're paying attention, right? That's basically why you want to do this. People will read it that way. Now, this is kind of a subtle thing. It's more of an advanced technique, but one of the things we know is that when people actually take a step towards you, if you take a step towards others when they are talking, that audiences will perceive that as you are invested or interested in what they're saying. So a trick that really advanced speakers will do is if I'm interacting with the audience and I say, um, how much of a difference would it make in your life if you had 10 extra hours? If I could just give you 10 extra hours in your week and somebody is responding, they're answering, or I say, tell me their main source of frustration with this experience, right? And somebody's talking, and while they're talking, I take a step towards them, or they just ask a question, I take a step towards them. That will usually they will perceive that kind of consciously or subconsciously as I'm interested in what they're saying. And what you do is you then take a step back when you're answering the question or after you start talking again as the speaker. Because otherwise, of course, you would just keep approaching them, right? And you don't want to do that because you're going to end up just like too close to the audience and make them uncomfortable. But again, how would you apply this in a non-public speaking setting? You're in a conference room and you're at that table and somebody's talking. You ask a question and while the person's talking, you could maybe you're saying you want to be right, not slouching, but you can maybe lean in a little bit, right, while they're talking, and then lean back as you answer, right? So that's just a little subtle trick. You might not use that necessarily, but it's kind of an advanced technique I wanted to throw in. As far as the deal with your hands, like why you don't want them behind your back or in your pockets. So the in your pockets thing, audiences tend to perceive that as being too casual. Behind your back, same thing. It's like a casual thing. There's another thing going on here, which is that some of the things about nonverbals really comes from what like essentially evolutionary psychology. I don't really love the phrase evolutionary psychology. I think it's probably more appropriately should be termed psychology, like the evolutional psychology of human experience, right? So basically, if you think about it, right, if you were going to just because we know, for example, that like when people are judged non-verbally, right, when they're evaluated, right, just beyond public speaking, right, like judgments people make about nonverbals, that in general there's a variety of categories we will place people into right away. So we kind of size them up, right? And we will size them up into these categories such as like friend category or enemy category, for example. And there's actually only like there's a lot of subcategories, but there's really about three or four main ones. So if you think about it, if you can't see somebody's hands, we know through evolutionary psychology that you are more likely to perceive them as an enemy, right, or a potential threat. Now, if you think about it, why is that? Why would that happen through like just the evolution of human experience? Well, because if I can't see your hands, I can't see if you have any weapons, right? And so I don't know if you're a threat. So if you think about it, that would be a useful sort of shortcut to use before humans even had languages, right? And even now with languages, right? You're walking down the street, you see somebody and you can see kind of see their hands. They're holding a cup of coffee and they're scrolling through their phone or they're doing whatever. You know they're not as much of a threat versus if they had their hands in their pocket, right? Like I think we could agree with that. So it's basically that issue. So what you want to do with your hands, and we'll talk a little bit about this more with gestures, is you always want to have your hands open facing the audience, and in fact it's better if they can even see your palms, right? And we do know that there is research with this with audiences where you could show them somebody talking, or there's even studies done with this with like actors and actresses, because it's like delivering a scene, and so you want them to just change their gestures and have the same tone of voice and the message, everything's the same, right? And if the person is talking and the actor or actress is talking and they're doing this, it's open palms, you can see my hands, you are overwhelmingly more likely to trust me and think I'm sincere and honest with what I'm saying. Versus if they're closed off, if they're defensive, they're behind my back. So you want to make sure that your hands are open forward to the audience. Obviously sometimes you have no cards in your hands or you have a laser pointer if you're moving a PowerPoint, but it just matters that they see your hands. Okay. Let's look at eye contact. So, eye contact, it turns out that this is important, right? Now, this varies a little bit by culture. I will say, if you study other cultures, I sometimes teach intercultural communication. There are actually some cultures where eye contact is considered abrasive and potentially offensive. So it can change. But if we're talking about American culture, generally Americans perceive eye contact as showing interest in a topic, respect, right? That's usually how people perceive that. So it's a good thing, right? So you generally want to look at individuals within the audience at least for a few seconds, right? And it also helps people feel acknowledged, right? So I gave you that example of you're talking to somebody, they're not making a lot of eye contact with you while you're having this conversation. That is going to probably give you this sense they don't really care, they're not really listening, right? It's sort of like, and again, this is just something a nonverbal thing to keep in mind to like pay attention to your behavior. It's like if somebody's talking to you, and especially if they're talking to you about something that's really important to them, right? This is like this topic really matters, and you just like get up and start doing something else while they're talking. You're flipping the channel while they're talking. Like that's sending this nonverbal signal to them of like you don't care. Now, oftentimes you might not mean it that way. In fact, a lot of times you probably don't mean it that way, right? But pay attention to that. Because again, if this mattered to you, why are you flipping the channels? Why are you checking the my stuff on your HBO Max account, right? If this is such a big deal to you. So we read nonverbals to interpret if you care or not. And then this is kind of what's happening with eye contact, right? And so it is important to make eye contact. Now, you don't want to stare people down. The second bullet is talking about something called the look away. So, research into American audiences shows that if you make eye contact for more than 10 seconds, people feel like you're staring them down, and they take it as too confrontational or assertive or aggressive. So, don't do that. Whether you're a speech or in a conference room, you're on a blind date, on it, right? Don't do it. Don't not interview, right? More than 10 seconds. Now you can look away, you just have to break it. So let's say again you're in a job interview, somebody asks a question and you're answering the question, or they're talking, you're making that eye contact. You can just look away briefly and then look right back at them, but you do gotta break it. Okay. So what do you do if you struggle with eye contact? Because this is one of the things that makes people nervous in public speaking settings. It's one of the things that they're the most worried about. So how do you what can you do? Okay. To minimize this impact. So there's a couple of tricks. One thing you can do is you can look at points in the room instead of looking at people. Now, what you want to keep in mind is two things. One is make sure you pick a point in each section of the room. Don't just look down the middle. Make sure you're looking to the right, to the middle, and to the left. Second issue is you need to make sure the point is eye level. So I, for example, have taught in classrooms where there is a screen and projector up front, and then there's one in the back. And that is actually meant so the instructor can actually be kind of reading the PowerPoints off of that while they're talking. But the problem with that is it's not really eye level. So it's obvious if that's what I'm doing, right? Now I'm not doing that anyway, but that's a problem. So you do need to make sure that if you do pick points in the room that it's eye level. Okay. Now the bigger trick that most people are taught, that most presenters are taught, is what's called shrinking the audience. Okay. So what shrinking the audience is you basically go into a presentation and let's say there's 25 people in the room. and you just pick three people to look at and you give the speech to them essentially, right? So you one in the and again through each point in the room. So one person in the center, one in the right, one in the left, you just look at them. Another thing you can do is if you want to be a little more sophisticated about this is even better, is you pick three people maybe for your introduction, and then another two people for your first main point, another two people for your second main point, right? And everybody else just kind of like blurs out. And so that's like a really like simple technique that most people can do, right? And it really does help reduce anxiety because you're kind of only giving the speech to those people, right? In your head. So shrink the audience if need be, but that's a way to avoid eye contact. But it is, or to limit sort of the impact of feeling like, oh my God, I got to look at everybody. Okay. Gestures. Now, some people actually argue, I mean, this is debatable, but will argue that gestures are actually the most important of the nonverbals because you're just more likely to recognize it, right? So you make eye contact with somebody, you're going to scan the room. Not everybody can catch that. Not everybody will catch every facial expression you make, right? Some people just, if you're moving across the room or you're moving in place a little bit, they might not catch all of that either, or it might not have the desired effect you want every time, but you're likely to see what people are doing with their hands, right? And so some people argue it's the most important. I'm actually going to show you some research here in a second that suggests that maybe it is. So you have three basic types of gestures. You have descriptive, prompting, and emphatic. Descriptive is helps the audience compare and contrast or visualize a concept. So if I say there was a large crowd, right, and I use my hands to emphasize that. Prompting is used to create a response from the audience. So I say by a show of hands, and I raise my hand as well, right? And emphatic is emphasizing what's being discussed. So if I pound my fist on the table, right, or I point, that's emphatic, like I am serious or something like that. And so you have these three types of gestures. Now, a couple of things I mentioned, sort of like the psychology that we know of how people evaluate this is so talking with, I just mentioned this earlier, talking with your palms open and upward is perceived as expressing honesty. So talking like this, right? Because again, people can see your hands, and it's basically I have no weapons, right? And also it's basically like this no tools, no weapons concept, which is, and also if you think about it, just again, just the basic like primal instinct of our psychology would be somebody who's open like this, they're also not being defensive, right? So like if you're like this, your hands, this is defensive, right? You're like literally guarding your body. And so that's part of why we subconsciously will take somebody who's like sitting there looking at you like this as a little standoffish, is a little closed off, because they're literally giving you a logical reason to think that. It's not just like, sometimes these feelings you get in your gut, these like intuitive senses, there's a reason for them. It's not just your gut, there's some logic to it. And in this case, you are closing off your body, right? And so when I see your palms, you are not only am I you showing me you have no weapons, you're also showing me that you're not defensive. You're like opening yourself up, so literally, physically, right? And so it's perceived as honesty, right? That and that you're trustworthy and that you basically believe in what you're saying. A couple of other things here that we know that happen is pressing your fingers together and talking like this, right? People perceive, or with your thumb up like this, right? That people tend to perceive that psychologically as that you are confident, right, and authoritative with what you're saying, that you believe in what you're saying, right, that you're really sure. And I have politicians here because politicians get trained in this. So if anybody that kind of has to do a lot of public speaking, or excuse me, such as them that are in the public eye a lot, they will get trained in using all of these things to try to get in that friend category, or get in that you should trust me, I'm honest, right? I'm authoritative kind of categories. That's basically what's going on with these gestures. So I mentioned I was going to talk about some research to show you that would kind of support this proposition that gestures are maybe the most important or the most effective of the nonverbals. So these gesture compliance rates, and they do these studies, again, you take actors and actresses because you want to take somebody who can basically deliver this like a scene. They can go into real customers, real clients, real potential investors, and audiences, right? Give this presentation, because what you're really studying is audience reactions, right? But you give you want them to be able to give the scene, give the presentation identical in terms of not just everything they say, get their lines right, so to speak, but tone of voice, like movement, all of it's got to be the same, facial expressions. The only thing they want you to alter is the gestures, and let's see what happens, right? And obviously, they'll take lesser known people. You can't have Brad Pitt come in, right, and do this, but they'll just take lesser known people. By the way, if you ever watch, I know you know, a lot of you kids, you've cut the cord, you're blocking out, you're not watching commercials. But if you ever if you ever paid attention to commercials, this is maybe a nerdy mass media communication point, but you'll notice if you pay attention, notice how they use the same five people in like all year in like 50 commercials. So you'll see like you know recently I've noticed there's this girl, she's in a Bear paint commercial, then she's in a commercial for like LensCrafter, and I want to say I saw her in a jerky commercial. I've seen this guy who's a beef jerky commercial, and then he's in the Verizon commercial, and then he's in the like Credit Karma commercial. Like they just use the same people over and over. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, they'll pick people for this who are not really well known. So anyway, they do these studies, and here's what they find. So if you go in there and you point at people, right? If you point at people or you're using more of like closed off enemy, so you're crossing your arms, you're slouching back, that kind of stuff, defensive, the fist, the point, then you'll get about a 28% compliance rate, meaning of the audiences that you gave that presentation to, about 28% of them would still actually buy into the product or service. So they still liked what's called the value proposition. So I don't know if you ever heard the term value proposition. It's basically something you hear in a business or a marketing course, or if you're just involved in business. It's basically the notion of, is the product or service worth the price point? So is HBO Max worth 19.95, whatever you pay for it, right? That's a value proposition. So basically, the value proposition is always the same here. We're just changing the gestures. So 28% still like the value proposition, that they can basically overlook the fact that your gestures weren't great. Okay. Palms down. So now you're not really doing defensive, but you're not doing the honesty things either. You're not doing the confidence things either. You're just kind of like, you're not closed off, but you're not showing me. I can see your hands, but it's not like this, right? It's just kind of little more closed off. It's a little more neutral in your gestures. It'll go up to 52%. So that's a 24% increase right there just by not pointing at people and putting your hands in your pocket. That's pretty significant. That's why this matters. Now, palms up. Now, this is basically, hey, I'm doing the honesty stuff. How's your pal, man? You got to trust me, right? I'm doing this, right? And I believe in what I'm saying. It goes up to 84%. It's the same value proposition. It's the same goods and services for the same price, right? You screen for similar audiences, and now it's gone up to 84%. That should not happen, right? That's pretty crazy, right? So basically, what this means, the reason I say this shouldn't happen is like, if you think about it, it's a little superficial that if what you're offering that audience, if the value proposition is the same, that 20 32% more people will, if I'm neutral versus open palms, will say yes for the same offer. That's pretty crazy just based on my hands, right? So this tells you how important gestures are, because like think about it, what the totality of all this means is that I can walk into a lot of businesses and say, you know what, I can increase your conversion rate, how often you get to yes, by 56%, because the difference between 28% and 84% is 56%, right? And it's called, and you don't got to change the price point. You don't got to change the quality of something. You don't got to change how fast your shipping is. You know what you need to do? Pay attention to your hands, right? Pay attention to your hands. That's crazy. So that tells you how important gestures are, okay? And really what this is about is gestures that get you into the friend category. So I mentioned that people get judged on they get put into these categories: friend category, enemy category. um, and so what you're really trying to do is get into the friend category, right? That I'm trustworthy, I'm honest, I'm on your side. And so that's kind of what this is going to. And by the way, real briefly here, speaking of the friend category, I don't talk too much about it on these slides, but since we had mentioned we're talking about gestures here in the friend category and eye contact, one other thing I wanted to point out is with your eye contact is you need to smile at people. Okay, so one of the things that if you think about it, first of all, a smile is universal. Everybody knows what it means. It crosses cultural barriers. It crosses language barriers. A smile always means friendly, right? So you need to smile at people along with making the eye contact. In fact, if you make eye contact and you smile at people, they'll actually smile back at you if it's an authentic smile. Now it needs to be an authentic smile. It can't be just some sort of half smile or a smirk or something like that. But actually smiling at people and making that eye contact, that's another way to get to that friend category. So it's really, really important. Okay. Movement. Why does movement matter? So first of all, movement creates something that's called an orienting response. So what an orienting response is that people pay attention to things in their environment that they're not used to. That's unusual. So this is why when you're driving down the street and you hear a police siren, that gets people's attention because they're not used to sirens, right? Um, and so some of you are like, well, I don't know, man, my neighborhood, I don't know. I don't know what your situation is. No, hopefully you don't hear a lot of sirens. Some of you like reminds me of home. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Okay, so we pay attention to things that are unusual. Okay, and that's what movement's designed to do. So when you move across the room, what it does is, as long as you're not like, and this is why you don't want to pace, by the way, because if you're just pacing, that means the movement's random. That means it's no longer unusual. So I don't got to pay attention to it, right? But if you move strategically, move across the room, I'm not talking about a step here and there, but big shifts in the room, if you do it strategically, it's going to refocus people's attention. It's going to create that orienting response, right? So when do you want to do it? You want to move across the room when you want to refocus people. So you want to do it during transitions from your introduction, your main point, and your conclusions, because you're trying to reset their focus as you move on to the next main point, right? So that's when you want to do movement. By the way, it's just speaking of nonverbals and then this is creating something, this movement during transitions, like between main points and after your intro into your first main point, etc. This is what's called signposting. So I talked about in my video on verbal delivery that signposting, this concept that you also would have heard of in others, if you've been trained in public speaking at all, this notion that you use your delivery to emphasize your organization. So your audience knows what matters a lot. And because if you're perceived as organized, your audience is more likely to perceive that you know what the heck you're doing, right? That you're like trustworthy and that you're believable in your content. So this is signposting when you move across the room because you're showing, hey, new main point, important concept, right? That's signposting. Now, since we're just talking about this here with the movement, one thing I will mention another signpost is this is also when you can refer to the visual aids. This is when you flip the slide, right? So if you move the visual aids right at the transitions, it sets for people, okay, next main point, right? So that's what you can do. And by the way, let's say sometimes you might have a problem with the movement across the room for two reasons. One is the room setup might not be conducive to, right? That happens sometimes. There's just not a lot of places to go, right? Second of all, you might not be conducive to it. And what I mean by that is you just might not be comfortable with it. Okay. Now at some level you got to get out of your comfort zone, right? Like it's not a philosophy class, but they say of the many ponderings in life. I know those philosophers, right? They'll say things like, if you're not challenging yourself, that means you're not growing. And if you're not growing, right? Is that really good? Is that the life you want to lead? You don't want to do that, right? But anyway, there's a fine line. Like sometimes obviously we need to challenge ourselves, but there's also sometimes where we need to like understand that like I'm just this is not something I'm comfortable with. And I'm not really ready to do this, right? So let's just say there is a situation where you can't move across the room because the room's set up, or you just really aren't comfortable doing that. It's just not you, right? Or maybe you have a lot of note cards and you kind of want to set them there by the podium and you step aside away from the podium. We're going to talk about podiums in a second. Or maybe you don't have a laser pointer and you've got to be up there up by the computer to flip the slides. Or there could be a reason why the movement's just not going to happen. So that's another reason why this is when you can flip the visual aids, right? That can help like take the place of the movement. Now, again, you can obviously do both, but that's a way to create some change up in the physical scene without the movement if you need to, right? Another option you can do where this is like less movement, but it's a way to like enforce it, is if you're doing opposing sides, you can like just change positions that way. So pro, con, right? Or introduction, first main point, second main point, third main point, conclusion. You could do something like that, right? Another thing you can do if you want to add a little physical movement, but you're kind of tied up there by the podium or something like that for whatever reason, is you could do your introduction and then you take a step or two towards the audience for your first main point, then a step or two to your second main point, right? And so forth, right? And then you come back, right? So your second main point, then you take a step back, third main point, then conclusion. So you kind of do this. That's another sort of option for you. Now, generally, you do want to avoid podiums unless you're in a situation where you're trying to convey respect or authority. So if you think about it, when do you ever see people give a presentation next to a podium? It's always authority figures or people trying to get some sort of respect or authority. Like even uh, sometimes you'll see people they get in trouble and then they got to give the apology speech. I used to show in classes like the Tiger Woods apology speech, and he did that like he's behind the podium, like he called the press conference. He didn't have to be behind a podium. Like he had total control of the environment, and some would say which apologies. Well, I don't know. He's done a lot. He's got in trouble for a lot. But anyway, first apology speech. And so, what is he trying to do there? He's trying to convey or get back some sense of control and authority and respect in the situation. So, that's the issue with podiums is the reason people say to avoid them is because usually when you're giving a speech, you're trying to convince people not that like I'm above you and I'm trying to get one over on you or this is a win-lose situation, right? You're not trying to use a sports analogy that I've used before. It's like you're not trying to win the trade here, right? What you're trying to convince typically, right? What you're trying to convince people of is that I'm looking for a win-win situation that's good for both of us. And so there's a phrase in business called get on the same side of the desk. And what get on the same side of the desk just means is make people feel like I'm on a team. We're on a team. We're working together. We're looking for a win-win and something that's in both of our interests. So this isn't me behind the podium and you're on the other side. So you just don't want to send that nonverbal signal that I'm sort of above you or separated from you, and that's how people read podiums because that's how they're used to seeing podiums. That's the person separated from me, who has some sort of authority or is different than me, right? So generally, you want to use podiums. So what can you do if you're in a room that has the podium? Well, you can either just move around and not even use it at all, or you could set your notes on it and then as like a placeholder for that, or the laser pointer when you're not using it or something like that. So and then step to the side and move. So that's what you can basically do with a podium. Or if just the room has a podium, step aside, move away from it. You don't have to be tied to that podium. And sometimes if you want to be like super sophisticated, there are some presentations where people will step away from the podium, but at other times actually use the podium within the same speech. Now, but again, that Will and I should tell you that. Like, I'm just saying there are some situations like that. Is that rare? It is absolutely very rare. And by the way, what would be a situation like that? I will do that in certain opening and closing statements, where there are times when I'm behind the podium because I'm making a point that's either highly technical legally and I'm trying to send this subtle message to the jury of like, look, pay attention to this. This is a highly complicated legal concept, and you got to get it right. And I want to send the motion that look, I'm the lawyer. I know what I'm talking about, and this is not about feelings. This is about the law, and this is not about every fact that's irrelevant. It's about the relevant facts as applied to the law. And I need you to listen to me right now, right? I need you to like sort of respect my authority as me being the lawyer, and that's why I'm behind the podium. Or if I'm cross-examining a witness, I'm in control. You're my witness. I'm the one who's asking the questions here. That's why I'm behind the podium, right? And so, but yet, if it's my witness, I might step away from the podium. And there's times in that opening or closing statement where I step away from the podium. So there are some presentations like that where you mix it up a little, but you're generally not going to mix it up. So generally, you're going to want to stay away from the podium on almost all other 99.9% of speeches. So that's what you want to think about with podiums. All right, spatial zones. It turns out you have a bubble and you don't like people in it. Okay? You don't want them out of your bubble. It's fine. You want them to social distance from you. That's okay. Um, Now, bubbles also varies by culture. It's not, people have different cultural bubbles. This is basically American culture. So here's how this basically works people will naturally, if you're walking around with somebody that you're friends with or you're close to, we will generally carry ourselves, we're comfortable, whether it's that or sitting next to them, in this 1.5 to 4 foot zone. Okay, that's like the friend zone that we're comfortable with. Friend zone. Hey, don't want to go there. That's never good. Friend zone. Friend zone town. Population U. That's not good, guys. Don't get in the friend zone. It's okay. You can be in the friend zone. You gotta have friends, right? Sorry, just getting off topic. All right, so that's the friend zone, 1.5 to 4 feet. Social distance. So this is you're not a friend, but you're not my enemy either, right? Like we're, I don't know, I've seen you around. That's 4 to 12 feet. So an example of this would be you go into a class and it's the first day and there's only one or two other people there and it's a pretty big classroom. You kind of sit wherever you want. And let's say the two people in there have been in classes with you before. You are probably going to be perfectly fine sitting, and a lot of times you'll just go ahead and sit. And you've even talked to them in classes, right? So they're not your friend, but you've seen them around, and you talk to them a little bit. You're more likely to sit in that 4 to 12 feet. You probably will not sit 1.5 to 4 feet, like seat right next to them, unless for some reason you're like, oh, I really like talking to them, and I want to like maybe see if we could be friends, kind of thing. You want to like develop the relationship. Generally, you'll sit in that 4 to 12 feet range. Now, let's say you walk in that class, so it's the like, yeah, you're not an enemy. That's why that's a 4 to 12 foot range. Now, let's say you come in the class and it's two people you've never seen before. You've never had a class with them. You even know these people. Who are they? You're more likely to be in that 12 foot distance. Okay, you're not gonna because it's like I don't even know you. You could be an enemy, right? This maybe a better example. This is like when you go to the movie theater and there's all these empty seats because nobody goes to movies. You guys aren't going, which I get. It's so expensive. Like you could buy the movie. You could pay for a month of streaming. So I understand. But anyway, you go in the movie theater. It's all empty. There's plenty of seats. You are probably going to sit 12 feet away from anybody else in that theater. Period. Right? Because you don't know these people. They're not your friends. They're certainly not your buddies. So those are like they're the natural zones that we gravitate towards, um, except for when we're like forced to violate them. So some examples would be you get into an elevator. There's only so many feet in an elevator, so obviously you kind of have to be within 1.5 to 4 feet from each other. But by the way, even in those situations, we have sort of unwritten rules. So it's sort of like when two people get in the elevator, like one person isn't like here and here's the door, so the person walks in. They don't like face them right there and stare them down. They usually turn away from them or they're like by the side. They're not like right in their face, right? So we still have like these rules we enforce about the zones to try to respect them, even if they're sort of forced to be violated a little bit. So those are the spatial zones. Now, why would this matter? Why in a public speaking course does the spatial zones matter? The reason this matters is essentially you want to stay in the right zone for your topic and how your audience is responding to your speech topic. So what I mean by that is if you are giving a presentation and you are preaching to the choir, meaning I think that audience is either really on board with what I'm talking about, they're going to be, and they are based on how the speech is going, or they're just likely to be receptive to what I'm going to say. You can stay and get in that 4 to 12 foot range, right? So you're already on board, man. I know you're going to agree with this. I'm telling you something that's good for you, and everybody's going to agree. This isn't really debatable, right? That 4 to 12 foot range is going to have is totally fine. But if you're going to come in the room and you're gonna tell people things that they might not be receptive to, they might respond hostilely to towards, right? So like they're doing A and you're going to tell them to do B. They believe A, you're going to tell them they're wrong and they should believe B. You probably, excuse me, you should probably stay about 12 feet away from them. You need to like respect that zone because they'll get uncomfortable. Is basically what I'm saying. So anytime these are violated, people are uncomfortable. So again, go to that classroom setting. You walk in the classroom, it's a total stranger. You never even had them in other classes. If you sit right next to them, you're probably going to make them uncomfortable, right? Because like there's lots of room, man. Lots of seats. You don't have to be right here. So, it makes people uncomfortable when you violate these. So in a speech, you need to be cognizant of that and sort of like basically assess it based on what do you think they're going to think of your topic and what you're saying to them. So if they're likely to be maybe not receptive or you might anger your audience or this is kind of an iffy or a tough sell, always start out that 12 feet and based on sort of how you're reading their body language, maybe stay the 12 feet. And if you think it's going well, you can go to that 4 to 12 foot range. Or vice versa. If you think they're receptive, you can be in that 4 to 12 foot range, right from the beginning, if you think it's a pretty easy speech for them to be receptive to. Now, again, sometimes the room's set up, there's only so much you can do here, but that's just what you want to think about. So just something to keep in mind about the zones. A couple of things one thing I would mention too is like sometimes people violate these strategically on purpose. So again, I will actually do this on purpose. So if I am cross-examining a witness, or I'm dealing with what's called a hostile witness or an adverse witness. A hostile or adverse witness, by the way, is when you call your own witness, and so in other words, they should be saying things I want them to say, and they go rogue. They're just saying all kinds of crap I don't want them to say. It's like, oh, this is bad. I will say, Your Honor, permission to treat them as a hostile or adverse witness, which basically means can I cross-examine them now? And because they're saying crap I don't want them to say, right? I gotta get them in line. So anyway, if I'm cross-examining somebody, they're not my witness. They're saying bad stuff for my client and me, right? You would argue, so I'm the enemy, I'm the other lawyer. They don't want to answer my questions or they don't want to say something stupid. So if I was going to respect being their enemy, I would stay 12 feet away. But I'm not going to respect being their sworn enemy. Okay, I'm going to disrespect it. Okay, all's fair in love and war and cross-examination, right? So anyway, is all fair? Those things? I don't think so. You still gotta have some ethics. Have some ethics, people. Um, so don't be a jerk, guys. Girls tends to be guys, I think, more fortunately. So anyway, so what will I do? I will violate that. So on purpose to get them frustrated. So they're the enemy. I should be staying 12 feet back. I will actually, while I'm cross-examining them, get closer and closer, as close as I can, quite frankly, because what I'm hoping is it makes them uncomfortable that I'm right in their face, and so then they're focused on that. They're focusing on how uncomfortable they are, and then they screw up and say something stupid that they shouldn't say or that they didn't want to say. Right? They stop lying and tell the truth because I was right in their face. Right? And so I'll violate it on purpose until the other side, depends on if they're smart. If they're a good lawyer, they'll object. They'll say I'm badgering the witness or I'm doing something, right? But so sometimes you actually do in certain situations would violate these, but usually you would not. But I did want to throw that out there that that's something to think about. And by the way, this image here, this is not a filler visual aid. If you remember my discussion on visual aids, the reason I put this up is because sometimes people will try to violate these to sort of and try to create a certain sort of working dynamic or relationship. So you have this image here of people in the conference room. So these conference rooms are set up where the seats are relatively close together, and the reason for that is they want to reinforce non-verbally this notion that we're on the same team, we should be working together, right? And we should be friends. So it tries to help like enforce that. So those are the spatial zones. Pay attention to them when you're talking. A couple of the things just about nonverbals in general that I just said that I just want you to keep in mind. In my classes, you don't have to dress up for the speeches or anything like that. But there's lots of research that people do make judgments on appearance, right? Fair or not, on a variety of things. So in terms of appearance, clothing has been suggested that clothing can convey at least 10 types of meaning. So just based on the clothes you're wearing, and so I look, there's these 10 broad categories. I personally think they all kind of come down to three. So they're all really like subsets of these three, which is that people will judge you based on your level of success. And this is like financial success, career success, even just social success. Are you one of the cool kids, right? Are you fat with a PH? That's the good kind of fat. It's you guys don't say that anymore. Uh, Education level, so they'll judge basically how educated you are, and moral character, right? You a bad guy or not? So they judge all of these just based on appearance. So you know, it's it's been studied, by the way, not just with clothing, but just general concepts with appearance in general. So this is just something to keep in mind. And this is one of those things about life where there's a difference between what is and what should, right? Is this fair? No, right? But who said life was fair, right? Just because something isn't fair doesn't make it not true. And so this is one of those things where you strive to change the world, and while you strive to change the world and make it what it should be, you got to play the game in the world the way it is. It means, and what I'm trying to say here is you got to be cognizant of this. You have to be aware of this, and just keep in mind people do make these judgments, right? So just be aware of it and, appear and behave accordingly, right? Because you don't want them to judge you in the wrong way. Other basic nonverbal essentials to keep in mind: choose an appropriate setting. So this just means a setting where people are going to be comfortable. So again, a classic example from my field is I will actually have a lot of clients or customers who will say, you know what, can we just I don't really want to, get down to I can't get down to your office. Can we just meet for coffee or something somewhere? And that may be more, what they're thinking about is that that's more convenient for them. And that may be more convenient for them. But the problem with that is not a setting where you're going to be comfortable. Like, so, okay, I met you at the coffee shop near you. Are you going to be comfortable telling me like these personal, private things? Your neighbor could walk in. The barista, right? As we sit there, like probably not. It's not a private setting, right? So you need to make sure you choose a setting, whether it's a speech or this isn't just a speech, but just like in general when you're communicating professionally or personally, that is conducive to whatever it is you're communicating about, right? So just keep that in mind about nonverbals. What is the setting here, right? And there's other like look, we could go into all kinds of avenues where that can matter. Another example would be just who else is in the room, right? Like sometimes people are not going to be open and transparent or really have an honest conversation depending on who else is there. So you got to think about that too. Make sure your initial body language suggests enthusiasm and sincerity. Why does that matter? Is because people make that judgment right away. They put you in the friend category, they put you in the enemy category, they put you in the indifference category, which means they ignore you, right? And so if you don't right away get in the right category, a lot of times what happens is they make that judgment within the first 30 seconds, 2 minutes, and then from that point forward, they're everything that you do, they're usually kind of interpreting based on that initial judgment. So I already decided I don't like you. So everything you do now, you're just sort of moving. That's the base. That's the standard I'm judging you on. I don't like you anyway, right? And so you've got to get in the right category, by the way. And by the way, one of the reasons you need to get in the friend category right away, this is more of a broader nonverbal communication, not just public speaking delivery point, but that's really important to keep in mind is here's the deal of these categories, right? So there's friend category, there is enemy, there is indifference, okay? By the way, the fourth category, because your mind's always in the gutter, guess what it is? Am I attracted to you? Are you hot? Right? That's the fourth category. So your mind's, you guys, it's always in the gutter. Come on, you guys. But anyway, it's those are the four categories, right? You know what the most common one is? It's indifference. It's just ignore people, right? So we ignore most people. So if you don't get into the friend category right away, guess what? Everybody ignores you. Nobody pays attention to you. So that's why it's really important that right from the beginning you do things to get into the friend category. You're making eye contact, you're having those open gestures, you're smiling, right? All of those things with people. Because otherwise they're probably going to ignore you, man. They're not going to pay attention to you. And why does that matter? Well, if they're not paying attention to you, then whatever it is you have to say, they're not going to hear it. It doesn't mean anything. They're not going to, right? Because they're ignoring you. So if what you have to say matters, if this moment matters, you better get in the friend category and you better do it right away because people make the judgment right away and they move on. Okay. So you want to do this early on. Assess your audience's body language prior to speaking and during your presentation. Look for what's called state changes and hold devices in your non-dominant hand. So I mentioned before, if you see my other videos on like public speaking anxiety, about how you want to hold devices in your non-dominant hand because you're likely to gesture and have and also any nervous tics you do are likely to happen with your dominant hand. So, like for example, I'm right-handed, so I'm more likely to gesture like this with my right hand than like this with my left. And so, if I'm holding note cards or the clicker in my dominant hand, then I'm going to be like waving them around, like they're more likely to be seen. I don't know what this is, jazz hands. I don't know. So hold them in your non-dominant hand. So this last bullet here I want to talk about. This is the last point of this video. This is really important. Okay, you got to remember this is like a big ticket nonverbal thing to remember. So pay attention to it. Assess your audience's body language prior to speaking, and during the speech, and look for state changes. And this is not just a speech in any situation. So here's why this matters so much. If I asked you guys and I said, "What is bad nonverbals?" like nonverbal communication or bad nonverbal behavior. You don't have to take a college class, and people would say things like not making eye contact, slouching, crossing their arms, right? You'd say all of these things, being fidgety, touching their face, doing all that. You'd say all that, okay? Here's the problem, those are not inherently bad. So inherently means always, right? 100% of the time, every time. They're not always bad. So technically, that's an incorrect answer. Now, why are they not always bad? Because some people just naturally carry themselves that way. Most people slouch, right? Lots of people sit with their arms crossed. Lots of people don't like to make eye contact. A lot of people are fidgety. Some people just bite their nails. I do. Disgusting habit. Have to stop it. Right? It's on my list. It's on my disgusting habits to stop list. I think it's at 17 right now. But anyway, the problem is disgusting habits, the bad habits. You know, they're up there. I gotta cut them down. You don't want the good habits that you have to be outnumbered by the bad habits. You gotta have a better ratio. But anyway, that's me. Personal problems. Look, people just carry themselves this way sometimes, right? And that doesn't mean it's bad. Like if I'm teaching a class, a lot of times, if I look out into the audience, like most people are slouching. There's always five people crossing the arms, right? That kind of stuff. It happens all the time. That's how people just kind of carry themselves. Okay, so it's only bad when it's a state change, when it's a reaction to things. So again, to give you an example, sorry, I've been using a lot of legal examples today, maybe too many. From my field, is this is not inherently bad because people just do this, right? Here's when this is bad. The police are interrogating the suspect, and they say, "Did you know the victim?" And they say, "No." "You've never met him?" "No." You don't recall ever, like you guys had some mutual friends and you've never met them? No. Okay. So how can you explain that we found your DNA inside their apartment? Why were your fingerprints on the inside door handle of the passenger side of the car if you've never met them? So when I say that, when a cop says that, and then the suspect does this, then how do you explain your DNA being in their apartment and then they do this? That's when they start doing this. That's when they break eye contact and they've been looking at you the whole time. State change. It's a reaction and it's a bad one typically. It's a defensive reaction, right? Then they start rocking. Okay. So you've got to look for the state changes and you can only catch it. So now that's an extreme example, but it'd be like if I'm giving a persuasive speech and I give you the value proposition. I say, will you buy the product or service for $29.95? And that's when you stop looking at me and you do this, you turn away, right? That's when it's bad. Or that's when they'd make eye contact, right? So you got to look for the reactions. You got to look for the reactions, right? And you can only do that if you were paying attention to how people carry themselves naturally, right? So, and if you think about it, this is part of why in an interrogation, just to stick with that example, they don't start out right away with the heavy hitter questions. It's a lot of how are you, right? Thanks for coming down, right? Do you need a cigarette? All this sorts of stuff. You want something to drink? You want a soda? Um, because they're part of what they're doing there. Now, some of that is just to make you comfortable, but part of what they're doing there is that's giving them time to read your body language. Let's see how this person naturally carries themselves. Do they sit with their arms crossed? Right? Do they bite their nail? What are they doing here? Right? Now, obviously, that example is a little more complicated because if you're being interrogated by the police, you're probably already nervous a little bit. But you assess it right away. So then when you give them the real key moments in the presentation, you can see how they reacted, right? So you got to catch the state change. So a couple ways to do this. Obviously, early on in your speech, right? As you're doing your introduction, when you're making eye contact, is be reading people, reading how they're sitting, read how they carry themselves, right? Read the reactions they're giving you then in real time for the state changes. You can also do this prior to the speech, just kind of look around the room, scan the room, right, and get a feel for this. So that's really important. It's something that people miss a lot of the time. All right. I hope you found this video helpful today as we discussed nonverbal delivery, and I look forward to seeing you guys hopefully in the next video. Thanks.